Sure, this episode asks, what is Starfleet? But I'm here to ask the real questions like, why is Starfleet? When is Starfleet? How many Starfleets does it take to change a light bulb? Hello interwebs, I hope you are all doing well, and welcome to my review of the latest episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Season 3, this one, Episode 7, titled, What is Starfleet? I will be honest, I'm going to try to stay in non-spoiler territory like normal at the top here, but quite frankly, this episode is a lot. I am 99% sure this is going to be one of the most controversial episodes of the entire season. This is going to be one of those episodes where I'm going to have to spend most of my time speaking about the broader implications of a lot of it. I think the best way to get into this is to give you some context. I'm recording this review before the episode actually officially airs because I get screeners like a few folks do. And the very night I got the screeners sent to me in my email, two of my friends who also get screeners texted me saying, hey, we need to talk about episode 7 because they did not like it at all. And one of their biggest points of comparison for why was the recent Doctor Who episode that aired on Disney Plus titled The Interstellar Song Contest. If those of you have seen the episodes, hackles are going up. Also, what is a hackle? But if your hackles are going up, yeah, you can already see where this episode's going to go. For those of you who haven't seen it, just to give you a not over spoilery version of the episode, and to simplify, that episode created a really deeply troubling metaphor for the Israel-Palestine conflict using the recent controversy surrounding Eurovision and Israel's involvement in it, and specifically in the context of Israel's currently ongoing genocide in Gaza. And that episode's fictional stand-in for Israel, or more precisely an Israeli corporation which conveniently allowed the episode to sidestep any direct critique of Israeli nationalism, is technically portrayed as bad, but the bulk of the narrative doesn't focus on that, instead focuses on its villain character, who is a member of the colonized, exploited people and the leader of a resistance movement, who is framed not as someone fighting for liberation, but as a violent extremist exploiting his people's suffering in order to justify mass murders of civilians.
Because I have met so many versions of you, kid, and revenge is just an excuse. Because your cold, filthy heart just likes to kill.
And as a result, the episode ends by presenting the only options for resistance to something like Israel's settler colonial violence as either senseless rage or sanitized respectability politics. Like, literally the episode has one of the people of the oppressed group singing a song and it changing people's hearts. There's no space in the episode for collective armed resistance to violence or attempting to wrestle with the complexities of systemic complicity, like those who watch Eurovision, who maybe even don't support Israel, but are still giving it a platform all the same to put forth its propaganda. Like, none of that was the focus of the episode. Just a false binary where anything outside of civility politics in the face of oppression is painted as monstrous. So it's a deeply, deeply problematic episode, even at the best of times, but made so much more worse by the real-world context in which that episode released in. I give all of that context to you, both the Doctor Who episode comparison as well as my friends' reactions to this episode before I even saw it, to let you know that I came into this episode of Strange New Worlds already a little bit wary. And that's not usually how I like to approach a review. I usually like to try and come in with a fresh face on it, but after hearing the strong reactions from my friends, I was a bit primed in this episode. That being said, though, my take differs from theirs slightly in that I do think this episode is bad and deeply problematic in a way that upsets me, but not in the same way as the recent Doctor Who episode. Because in that episode's case, the Israel-Palestine allegory was pretty clear and blatant, even if what it had to say about it was bad. Here, though, in my opinion, the allegory doesn't neatly map onto that conflict, though some elements of it do feel very vaguely familiar. And honestly, that kind of ambiguity could have been to this episode's strength. You know, one of Star Trek's greatest tools has always been abstraction, letting us explore the dynamics of power or violence and ideology without having to rely on a direct one-to-one allegory, even if, you know, Star Trek does one-to-one allegories all the time as well. The problem is here, this episode instead avoids providing any meaningful context for any side of the conflict that we step into here, including Starfleet's side, in a way that doesn't come off as thoughtful ambiguity, trying to talk about the dynamics of power, but just non-committal. Like it's afraid to say anything about any possible modern-day political dynamic. If I was being honestly a bit conspiratorial about it, it's also worth noting that this episode is 40 minutes long, which is the shortest episode of the entire series of Strange New Worlds by a wide margin. And given the heady themes that this episode is dealing with, I can't imagine that that is what the episode was written to be. And I wonder if key context of the backstory of this episode was cut in order to avoid drawing parallels to any real-world situations, whether it be Israel-Palestine or perhaps even Ukraine-Russia. According to the production pipeline on this episode, I did look, this episode was likely written before the 2023 writer's strike, and more importantly, before October 7th, 2023. So it is quite possible that the final version of this episode was edited down after it was filmed deliberately in order to try to avoid any parallels to any real-world contexts, which frankly to me feels a bit cowardly. To be fair, though, that may actually have been the better option, because while this episode is trying to desperately avoid talking about any direct real-world international conflicts, this episode certainly does still have something to say. It very clearly and explicitly states that it intends to explore the concept of whether Starfleet functions as a military force and whether the Federation operates as a colonial imperial power. And when I say overtly, I mean overtly.
Are they explorers as they claim? Or soldiers as they appear?
Like, it literally asked that question right up front, because the entire episode is framed not as a typical Strange New Worlds episode, but as an in-universe documentary that we've been seeing Ortegas's brother Umberto making this entire season. And while that framing device is yet another example of Strange New Worlds doing a format-breaking gimmick episode that it has been doing a lot lately, and I think a little bit too much, I actually really kind of love this idea conceptually. It's very similar to episodes like Babylon 5's And Now for a Word, which uses a journalistic format to step outside the usual perspective of the show and the main cast and let us see the world of the show through an outsider's eyes and a unique perspective, like the growing fascist Earth in that series.
A terrible explosion, a conspiracy involving several of these individuals, lies, deception, and the deaths of hundreds of people. All this and more in 36 hours aboard Babylon 5, here on the Interstellar Network News. We'll be back with our story right after this break.
I've always wanted to see more of the Star Trek universe from a civilian perspective, because we've only really gotten glimpses of that in shows like Deep Space Nine. And Umberto opens the documentary by literally asking, is Starfleet a military? Is it a colonial force? What is Starfleet? The title of the episode. And these are fascinating, long-standing questions and discourses, you know, in universe and within the fandom and discourse around the show that has been around for decades at this point and are absolutely worth exploring, especially when asked from the perspective of someone outside Starfleet itself, which is not how we typically engage with these questions on screen. You know, while Star Trek has a global fan base, it has always been very much rooted in a Western and very specifically American perspective. Throughout Star Trek's history, the Federation itself has narratively functioned as a stand-in for the UN or the United States, sometimes, and in my opinion, in the best of times, as a direct critique, and other times as a version of an aspirational version of what those systems could be. Like, I think one of the most obvious examples of that kind of discourse is the question that fans have always debated, which is is Starfleet a military? Because Starfleet clearly plays a military role for the Federation, just kind of like the U.S. military does. But unlike the U.S. military, Starfleet is also framed as primarily focused on exploration, diplomacy, and scientific discovery rather than militarism. And at the same time, even at Star Trek's most aspirational moments, Star Trek as a franchise carries the biases of its present-day origins and writings. Like, Star Trek is not a blueprint for the future, it is a reflection of how we think about the future today through a progressive lens, and more specifically, a progressive lens of the people who are writing it. There are deeply embedded Western assumptions and American assumptions, especially around power, progress, diplomacy, democracy, that echo in the Western and American attitudes and the biases of the writers of Star Trek and the audience watching it. And that, to me, frankly, is what makes analyzing Star Trek kind of so compelling. It gives us a view into progressive ideals of the time in which Star Trek was made, as imagined from within a future optimistic but still American framework. So I'm absolutely down for an episode to tackle all of that overtly and explicitly. But what this episode ultimately says about those themes, I find to be deeply troubling. And it's tying in to a larger issue that I've had with this entire season of Strange New Worlds. And given the context of the world we are in right now, not just Israel-Palestine, but what's happening in America with rising fascism, and also the stuff going on with the Skydance merger in Star Trek, I find this deeply, deeply worrisome. And as a result, this episode ends up reflecting, maybe unintentionally, but still clearly, some pretty progressive ideas about American power and morality. There's one scene in particular in this episode that I'll get to in a bit that wants to be profound, but instead feels condescending and honestly insulting and even anti-journalist. And that is even more galling coming from an episode that spends so much of its time actively avoiding trying to have any direct commentary about the world that we live in today, which is something that Star Trek should be doing because it's been doing it from the start. Okay, I've been dancing around getting specific, so I'm jumping into spoilers here. You kind of got the vibe of what this is going to be, though. Right from the jump, the episode roots us in Umberto's documentary perspective, which begins by asking us the question of whether Starfleet functions as a colonial or military power. And Umberto reframes elements that we usually take for granted in Trek as legitimate concerns. For example, through interviews, we see how Spock's biracial identity is often subtly racialized even within Starfleet and the Federation. And we kind of have Umberto visually lingering on Spock's ears with the camera, focusing on his racialized feature that marks him as an other from the primarily human-based Starfleet. La'an also is reframed not simply as a character whose traumas with the Gorn we know, and someone who legitimately has concern and pressure points when it comes to discussing the Gorn, but as a security officer aboard a heavily armed vessel who might have biases against the Gorn and might be willing to use militarism against an enemy.
If you were to encounter a ship you fought with before, like the Gorn, would you fire first?
Unless you can kill them first, the best move is to run.
And then Umberto takes this and asks us, why would a science vessel, something about primarily for exploration, need that many weapons, pointing out how many guns the Enterprise has. He also highlights early on in the plot how characters like Uhura and Ortegas follow orders without necessarily questioning that authority or what those orders are.
When it comes to executing Starfleet's orders, my job is to offer options, strategy, even alternatives. But my job isn't to question orders.
He even also, at one point in the episode, even references M'Benga's redacted past as a soldier, reminding us of the storylines that we've had with M'Benga, about how he carries guilt over his own violence in the Klingon War. And also how Pike and M'Benga have explicitly been avoiding M'Benga having to face any institutional or even personal accountability for any of that. Which, through Umberto's eyes, kind of reads, I think not without reason, as a kind of code of silence blue wall element that some cops have. How these institutions are more interested in protecting their own power and protecting the power of the state and each other than, protecting the people, which is what they're supposed to be doing. And through this framing that Umberto presents to us, we can see how Starfleet, when looked at through a certain lens, can feel and act less like explorers and more like soldiers. And I think this is a really interesting and great setup and question. I was genuinely curious at the start of this episode how this was going to explore these questions. You know, Star Trek has always carried that tension between its aspirational ideals of an evolved society and its depiction of Starfleet as something that can function as a neo-colonial force through military action and soft power. So this feels like a strong, provocative setup. It's a perspective that we rarely get within Star Trek itself, except for in Deep Space Nine, with characters like Garak and Quark acting as cynical, critical outsiders of the Federation.
It's so bubbly, cloy, and happy. Just like the Federation. But you know what's really frightening? If you drink enough of it, you begin to like it. It's insidious. Just like the Federation.
And as I mentioned in my non-spoiler section, given the timing of this episode's release, it's hard not to read the plot that we get in this episode through the lens of an Israel-Palestine metaphor. Many of us watching this are all primed for that reading. And you can see why it kind of, at first glance maps onto the situation here. Because we learn that the Lutani are under attack by another group called the Kassar, a planet that is, it seems, trying to expand its territory. And we're told also, with on-screen text, that the Lutani have suffered far more casualties than the Kassar, suggesting, not outright stating, and that's important, a power imbalance between the two. And that alone suggests that Kassar equals Israel and the Lutani equal Palestine. The allegory is even more reinforced by Erica's line during the briefing about the Lutani supporting the Klingons during the Klingon War.
The Lutani used to raid our cargo runs. Pretty sure they're helping the Klingons.
Because the Klingons across Star Trek, and especially in the original series era that Strange New Worlds is set in, have often been used to represent the USSR and Cold War era dynamics of that time. So if we look at it through that lens, the Lutani then echo how the Soviet Union at times backed Palestinian militants in order to try to counter U.S. influence within the Middle East historically. So it kind of lends credence to the metaphor there. And there's even, if you want to stretch it, you could even read a little hint of potentially Islamophobia in Erica's suspicion towards the Lutani. She's done that for the Klingons as well, as we saw last season under the Cloak of War.
It's a long con to gain access to Federation secrets.
Just because he's Klingon.
Trust me, I know Klingons. This guy with the peace treaties, that's not Klingons.
Certainly, though, Erica's bias against the Lutani is less racialized than Islamophobia, but it's still there. You could read it that way if you wanted to so do. That being said, though, this allegory is tenuous because we never learn any context for the Lutani-Kassar conflict. It's presented within the episode as a simple territorial dispute, and we never learn much more beyond that. There's no mention of a history of settler colonialism, occupation, or generational displacement that would better align itself with an Israel-Palestine metaphor. Because in real life, Israel-Palestine's conflict is not a war over land just in terms of one power claims it and the other claims it as well and they're fighting over it, or one's even just invading another nation. It is a long history of a settler colonial project that was enabled by Britain and later American imperialism. But we never get a sense of that history in here. And the episode never gets close to any level of the complexity by suggesting something like Starfleet was ever involved in the war before this point, like America is in the Israel-Palestine that has been going on for decades with U.S. involvement. There's also no mention of civilians, which is the big thing with the Israel-Palestine conflict and the genociding of Palestinian civilians. In fact, and I think more likely what this is probably intended to be, was a Russia-Ukraine allegory, with Kassar as the aggressor trying to annex Lutani territory. That would fit more directly here. But again, even with that, the details still aren't clear because we don't know the history between these two people. Why does Kassar want Lutani's land? What claim is it making to it? The whole thing with Ukraine-Russia is that Putin is the aggressive power trying to take Ukraine because he's claiming it was always part of Russia, and there was that long history there. It's absolutely bullshit. Ukraine is a place with its own people and history, but Putin is trying to sort of say, no, it is historically part of Russia, and it's really not a land with its own history. It's Russian history, so I want to reclaim it for the Russian state. That's his propaganda on it. And also, we never learn if these two sides, the Lutani and Kassar, are equal militarily, with the Lutari just on the back foot, which is why it's had more civilian deaths, or are the Lutani an oppressed, colonized people, or a smaller nation state trying not to be annexed? Or hell, we don't even know if they were the original aggressors in a much longer history. We just don't fucking know. Everything is so vague that no metaphor can really map on to this. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if that vagueness was intentional, either in the script or through editing, to keep the episode as apolitical as possible. And to be clear, I don't need the episode to be a one-to-one allegory. I mean, look at something like Star Wars Andor, which draws from a myriad of disparate historical and modern-day examples, such as the Israel-Palestine conflict, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, in very specific ways, as well as like the French resistance, and then maps that onto a Star Wars aesthetic to expose the mechanisms of fascism and imperialism. It's not a one-for-one allegory, but it draws from these things. But why that works in Andor is because Andor is specific about its own context, and it pulls from these dynamics, but also tells its own tale that looks and gestures at the broader structures of these things without necessarily saying, you know, this is this. But here in Strange New Worlds, we don't get any specificity, which only serves to make the episode confusing and ultimately hollow, especially when we get to the end of the episode. But what the episode does do is it shifts focus over to Starfleet, which is providing aid to the Lutani by giving resources to them and transporting for them a spacefaring creature. Which, by the way, I will say, looks incredible coming out of the sea. Like, the visual effects artist on that did a great job. Hot fucking damn. But through Umberto's documentary, we remain focused on Starfleet, and we see that he, Umberto, is suspicious that Starfleet's aid isn't purely altruistic. The problem, though, is he gives no concrete reasons for that suspicion. Is he suggesting that Starfleet wants to expand its influence in the region by helping the Lutari over the Kassar, having a sort of colonial soft power influence there? Are the Lutani near the Klingon border? And so Starfleet helping the Lutani would give them a presence near the Klingon border that they would like to have? Is there some other thing that is going on here? Like, there's just nothing here to, like, give credence to Umberto's questions of, like, Starfleet acting as a colonial power. Like, why would Starfleet be doing any of this? That's actually important to asking these questions about whether Starfleet's acting as a military and colonial power here. Specifics matter, but we never find out. So the show raises the question of Starfleet trying to impose this soft colonial power, but refuses to ground that suspicion in any context, so Umberto's worries just come off as vibe-based, and therefore kind of baseless. And that's a problem that we'll be coming back to, because that is weaponized against Umberto's character and point later on. But then we learn the twist of the episode, which is that the Jakaru, which is the species that they are transporting for the Lutani, is a weapon that the Lutani plan to use against the Kassar. Something that is implied that the Enterprise crew, or at least anyone below Pike and Una, didn't know before they started this mission. And that's finally where Umberto's critiques start finally to gain some footing. He argues to Uhura outright that Starfleet's trafficking a weapon and its supporting for one side over the other, potentially to expand its influence, feels colonial to him.
What I don't get is how Starfleet can agree to bring a weapon of war to a distant planet. Help me understand that.
Again, for what reason, we don't know, but at least it's something, right? They're trafficking weapons. That's at least some base here. And at that point, I don't think Umberto's wrong to have that concern. And the episode seems to agree that Umberto has a point, but it is important to note that we're still rooted in his perspective through the documentary. He shows us footage of Una and Pike contacting Starfleet to report that the creature is a weapon, but Starfleet orders Pike and Una to deliver it anyways, which implies that Starfleet either already knew it was a weapon and approved of the complicity in carrying weapons for whatever reason, or just didn't care once they found out. Again, for whatever reason. Either way, they're willing to be complicit in helping arm the Lutani, but we're just left to question the motive again here because we don't have any context. Do they want to aid Lutani because it's the morally right thing to do? Or is it Starfleet trying to gain political influence in the area? Or is it both? Again, we don't know if Lutani are an oppressed society or an equal military power or why Starfleet wants to get involved. It just does not give us any context to allow us to reflect on the dynamics of power through a metaphor. And it's avoiding, again, specific allegory. I mean, just put it bluntly, if the Lutani are meant to mirror Palestine, the allegory makes no sense because the U.S. doesn't arm Palestine, it arms Israel. We're the ones supplying weapons to Israel, which is using those weapons to kill Gazan civilians in order to advance its colonial project, under the rhetoric that they're just doing it to wage war with Hamas. And if Lutari are not meant to be Palestinians but Ukraine, that works a little bit better because the U.S. does give aid and weapons to their fight against Russia. But that reading then gets really weird and conservative later on if we continue on with that metaphor. So we'll get there. We'll get there. We do learn, though, that within the Lutari's ranks, there's disagreement over the use of the Jutara as a weapon. The Lutari science vessel showing up trying to kill the creature and the dying scientist that Chapel deals with saying, "We were wrong," implies that there is some level of internal moral conflict within Lutari culture, either over how the weapon was created, the ethics of using it as all because of what it is, or because of the damage it could do to their opponents, to the Kassar. Problem is, again, we never learn which of those it is. It's important which of those it is. Are the Lutari scientists worried about being an Oppenheimer of like, oh, this weapon is too dangerous, we shouldn't be using it against our opponents? Are they just upset about the ethics of the creature, the way the creature was tortured in order to make the weapon? Like, we just never learn. And as a result, like, it's just like, okay, what's the reasoning here? Again, it's too fucking vague. Instead, though, Pike and Una, despite their clearly expressed discomfort at both trafficking a weapon and the fact that it's also clearly a living creature, choose to comply and follow orders, just becoming a tool of Starfleet's and the Federation's will.
We have orders, whether we like it or not. Same goes for the crew as well.
And throughout Umberto's interviews, we see that while the entire crew has some doubts about this mission, those doubts don't stop them from carrying out orders. So when Umberto expresses his worry to Uhura that this feels colonial to him, we are meant to assume he's right to be based on the limited context that he and the episode have given us in the documentary. However, as the plot continues, after the mechanism that controls the Jutara accidentally malfunctions, the crew then is forced to take additional measures to try to control the weapon so they can traffic it. And during this, we get a moment where we see Uhura breaking Spock's trust because we learn she told Chapel that he had a psychic reaction to the Jutara earlier on the episode, but she told Chapel that without Spock's permission. Umberto catches this on camera too, and he has his camera linger once again on Spock's ears, which subtly implies and highlights how Spock's racialized difference as a Vulcan, to a degree, is being exploited here. I mean, it's a very subtle but compelling point in the episode. Would Spock have been treated the same way if he were fully human? Like, should Spock feel compelled to put himself in danger as a Vulcan because he has psychic ability to try to help this situation, especially if it's being done through breaking his medical privacy, which is what Uhura's doing? Did she have a right to tell Chapel, oh, Spock had a psychic reaction to Jutara because he's a Vulcan? It kind of speaks to his racialized difference as a Vulcan being used here. And while we know Spock as a character would want to help, Umberto, who doesn't know Spock as well, has every right to feel like maybe Spock is feeling compelled to help in this situation in order to feel like he can fit in within Starfleet. That's a perfectly legitimate question for an outsider who does not know Spock to ask. I mean, hell, there have been times within the history of Spock as a character in Star Trek being racialized at times.
Keep your Vulcan hands off me. Just keep away. Your feelings might be hurt. You green-blooded half-breed.
And it's worth saying Spock helping here because he's a Vulcan and has the ability to do so actually endangers him to the point where he almost dies in this episode. So all of this is actually a really intriguing point to make. Too bad we never come back to it at all. But eventually, though, because of the malfunction and Spock's risk, we learn that the Dutara was tortured into becoming a weapon, which is quite literally a war crime. We also learn that it has been tortured to the point that it is permanently only able to think in terms of aggression and violence. Like, it has literally been physically altered to the point where it cannot think any other way.
Her brain chemistry was artificially altered to focus solely on violence and destruction. Causes her great pain.
Can you reverse it?
No.
And only here, at this point, upon learning this, do we finally see the Enterprise crew push back against their orders to traffic this weapon. Pike stands up to the Lutari and refuses to hand over the Dutara.
You threaten one of us, you threaten all of us. Trust me when I say you do not want the Federation as an enemy.
And then Uhura herself volunteers to risk her life to speak to the Juntara, because that's who she is. And then through Uhura, the crew learns that the Juntara wishes to end its own life, because in its own words, essentially through Uhura, it is too damaged and just wants to die.
It's tired of being a weapon.
Yes.
And this is where the episode starts to collapse for me. Because up until this point, all this is like, okay, it's vague, but there's some interesting questions being asked here. But the idea that this sentient creature, at least sentient in some level, because it's able to communicate with Uhura, is now physically too broken to the point that it just needs to die, falls straight into a dangerous trope that the traumatized, the oppressed, the abused can end up beyond healing, and the only thing that we can do for them is put them down. Pike even compares this to a horse that needs to be put down as if it's a mercy killing.
I didn't like what I had to do, but I did it.
That's the job sometimes.
I'm sorry. What? If we read the Juntara as a metaphor for Palestinians, or just oppressed people in general if you want to stay away from the specific allegory, the text paints them as irreparably broken, stripped of agency, and reduced to creatures of just pure rage. And as a result, their resistance isn't recognized as a struggle for survival or liberation, but dismissed as blind, irrational lashing out and a danger to everyone around them, regardless of how bad we feel for how they became this way. It's a condescending narrative that declares that they can never really heal, never be whole, never be free, and that the only conclusion that we can have is to allow them to die, erasing any possibility of them earning liberation or working toward collective healing by fighting back against those who oppress them. But even worse, if we expand out the allegory to the rest of the context of the episode and situation, with Lutari as stand-in for Palestinians, Ukrainians, or even a general metaphor for a group resisting oppression or colonial oppression, this gets even fucking worse. Because the takeaway would be, they've gone too far in how they fight back against oppression, so now we need to be the ones to scold them. It kind of bumps up against the same thing that the Doctor Who episode did, where it redirects accountability away from the oppressors and places the narrative focus on the moral burden of the victims in how they deal with said oppression. But, as I've said, again, this episode gives itself just enough vagueness and plausible deniability, let's say, to dodge that reading. Ultimately, all we can say with any clarity is that this storyline reduces the Lutari to just a side in a war that committed a war crime, something that Starfleet can wag its finger at without ever reflecting on its own role in the conflict. Because it's also important to note that Pike does say that he got permission from Starfleet to kill the Juntara before he does so.
I just spoke with command. They weren't thrilled with me, but given the circumstances, we're in agreement now.
Revealing at that moment that Starfleet as an institution was fine trafficking a living creature as a weapon, but draws the line when it becomes a literal overt war crime torture victim. We'll come back to that. Save that point. It's important. But here is where we get what I think is the worst scene of the episode. Uhura condescending to Umberto, stating to him that the only reason he was being critical of Starfleet and thinking it was a colonizer was because he was emotionally compromised, still bitter over his sister's injury by the Gorn and blaming Starfleet for it.
That's all I was trying to do. I was just trying to prove out a counterpoint.
I believe you think that's what you were trying to do, but you came here angry.
And the episode clearly wants us to take away that she's right. We've seen Erica the entire episode be frustrated with her brother for asking questions throughout the entire episode when he's supposed to be family and understand her, and that's why she's kind of being aggressive towards him. Aside, by the way, I will say I do love the idea that Erica has a whole mechanics garage in her quarters. That's great. But to this point, Umberto seemingly agrees with Uhura's framing and backs down. And I will give the episode some credit in the sense that Umberto is a bad documentarian. I mean, some of his questions to his interview subjects are deliberately antagonistic and simplistic and clearly biased. Like asking Pike, what does it feel like to kill? Is a question that's so obviously going to cause your subject to shut down, and is also clearly him setting up Pike to look bad. Like, it's very clear that he has a level of bias coming into the interview to try to frame things from Starfleet overtly being a colonizer. I mean, the episode at one point shows Umberto filming Uhura without her consent, as if to say, see, he's also unethical in his pursuit of a bias point.
Are you recording this?
I am, yes, that's my job.
So, like, yes, Umberto is a bad documentarian. What that does, though, functionally, within the context of the whole episode, though, is reframes all of Umberto's valid critiques throughout the episode. Not as thoughtful political analysis, but as the personal baggage of a guy with an axe to grind. It comes across as the episode kind of implying that the only reason we would ever view Starfleet as a colonial power, as Umberto has been doing this whole episode, is if we're biased and just don't understand what Starfleet is about. But regardless of Umberto's bad, biased framing of things, we did literally watch these same characters not question orders at first. We saw Starfleet instruct Pike to transport a living weapon and tell him to not ask questions, just follow orders. And the institution of Starfleet and the Federation only stopped when they learned they could be complicit in a war crime. And we don't have any context for why they wanted to do any of this in the goddamn first place. I mean, there's very clearly a possibility that Starfleet only stopped trafficking the Juntara not because of any moral justification, saying, oh, it's bad that we're getting involved in that war crime, but because the optics were just too bad. Like, oh, this would get out and make us look bad. And yet, the episode tosses all of that away simply to make the point that Umberto was biased for questioning any of it. It just feels like the episode is really saying, shame on you, you silly Columbia student, you just don't understand. It positions youthful activism as naive at best or biased and overly emotional, something to be scolded and corrected rather than taken seriously. It's an incredibly reactionary centrist position and condescending. And as a result, the message of the episode becomes less a story about colonization and more about teaching viewers to dismiss resistance and criticism of power, especially American power, as childish misunderstanding of a complex situation for saying the very clear and important message that colonization and genocide is bad. All while the episode itself refuses to even gesture or engage with any of the real-life complexity of similar situations like what's happening in Ukraine or in Gaza. This episode is like the exact opposite of the recent Superman movie, where, without spoiling the plot of that movie, Lois, at the beginning of it, rightly and correctly acknowledges the complexity of the geopolitics of the situation within the film, but Superman also rightly stays focused on saving the lives in immediate danger, and the film frames him as correct and heroic for doing so. Here instead, though, in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, the same sentiment gets scolded as childish with a smug little finger wag. And it takes all of that, and has Umberto, and thereby the episode, end on this feel-good message of the difference between a federation and an empire is the people.
What separates a federation from an empire? And a starship from a warship?
What is Starfleet? It's the people.
Starfleet, apparently, is good because the people who make it up are good. The implication here is that because individual officers like Uhura acted morally in this situation, we don't need to worry about institutional complicity. We don't need to worry about Starfleet acting as a colonizer because, hey, the people will ultimately do the right thing. The system ultimately works because the right people are involved, and they will be the ones that question the institution when it makes a mistake. They've got their hands at the wheel, you know. But that's a terrible argument because federations and empires are political structures, not groups of people. The narrative casts critiques that a political structure is acting in imperial ways as unfair, biased, or emotionally compromised because the people who make up the system mean well, while asking us to ignore how close Starfleet came to complicity in war crimes. It's a very, liberal, capital L liberal, centrist, establishment, Democrat kind of mindset, right? America, Starfleet can act as an empire, but it does mean well, and it may do some bad from time to time, but it ultimately will work out fine in the end because the right people will get there. It's very West Wing kind of brain. And then it ends up also saying, and really, it's the leftists who are raging about us being colonizers, who are really the problem because they're being too critical. It very much reads like a Gen Xer yelling at clouds about kids these days. And the episode rewards the institution of Starfleet for doing the bare minimum at the last minute, then reframes all questions of its motives as a personal vendetta without ever giving us any context for its motives in the first place. And given the real-world context of when this episode is releasing, that's an incredibly fucked up message, whether it intends it or not. Because while the episode keeps things vague enough to dodge any direct accusations of an allegory in text, it's airing at a time when real people, especially pro-Palestinian activists in the US, are being branded anti-Semitic or unpatriotic for criticizing US institutions complicit in genocide by both US political parties, both the Democrats and Republicans, and under the Trump administration, having these accusations be used as justification for having these people surveilled, jailed, and deported. This episode, whether it intended to or not, echoes the core logic that those arguments are based on. That critiques of the government or its allies must come from prejudicial bias, and that the institution may be flawed, but it's ultimately good in the end. This kind of exact uncritical praise of an institution, saying we should all just fit our role for the greater mission, is why I was so uncomfortable with the final song and message of the musical episode last season, where the theme basically was, our purpose is to serve Starfleet. Because while that message was mostly innocuous within that episode, that mindset leads exactly to this sort of shit in this episode. And I hear some of you already in the comments going, this episode is presenting Starfleet as aspirational, not as America now, but America as it could be. And yes, that is what Star Trek ultimately tries to say a lot of the time. But this episode never wrestles with the real complications behind that aspiration. I mean, compare this to other Star Trek series, for example. In the original series episode Errand of Mercy, the episode distinguishes that Kirk and the Federation are a multicultural democracy, while the Klingons are an expansionist empire, but points out that both governments are acting as colonial powers.
You of the Federation, you are much like us.
We're nothing like you. We're a democratic body.
Come now, Captain, I'm not referring to minor ideological differences. Here we are on a planet of sheep. 2 tigers. Predators. Hunters. Killers. And it is precisely that which makes us great.
And that ultimately is the episode critiquing not just the USSR, but the US's also complicity in doing Cold War era spheres of influence around the world. Hell, episodes like A Private Little War are literally about proxy wars and military aid, just like this episode of Strange New World is, but it actually gives us context for it and wrestles with the actual dynamics of it, and again points out Federation complicity by explicitly relating that situation to the United States.
Do you remember the 20th century brush wars on the Asian continent? 2 giant powers involved, much like the Klingons and ourselves. Neither side felt that they could pull out.
Yes, I remember. It went on bloody year after bloody year.
If we want to get into other Star Trek shows, there's Deep Space Nine, which takes a far more cynical view of Starfleet as an institution, while still saying that the people who make it up are still fighting for its ideals. You know, that show shows our heroes wrestling with the ethical dilemmas that Starfleet as an institution forces them to be in, sometimes being harmed by it, sometimes benefiting from it, sometimes pushing back. I mean, Bashir, for example, faces institutional prejudice as a genetically engineered officer, yet he still tries to fight to save others as a Starfleet officer. While Sisko, for example, becomes often morally complicit in state-sanctioned lies in order to preserve the Federation, like in episodes like In the Pale Moonlight, because he believes in Starfleet over the Dominion, and we as the audience are left to sit in the moral gray area of the decisions that he had to make to uphold Starfleet as an institution over the fascist Dominion.
I lied. I cheated. I bribed men to cover the crimes of other men. I am an accessory to murder. But the most damning thing of all, I think I can live with it.
That's an episode that lets us sit in the interesting moral questions here. Hell, even in TNG, we'd see Picard actively register his problems with Starfleet even if he did carry out his orders, like in episodes like Journey's End, where he argued that the forced relocation of a population was wrong. And you even still had characters like Wesley Crusher resign their commissions in protests.
I know Admiral Nechayev gave you an order, and she was given an order from the Federation Council. But it's still wrong.
That decision is not yours to make, Cadet. I don't know what has got into you lately. And frankly, right now, I don't care. But I will tell you this. While you wear that uniform, you will obey every order you are given. And you will conform to Starfleet regulations and rules of conduct. Is that clear?
Yes, sir, it is. But I won't be wearing this uniform any longer.
Or hell, look at Star Trek Discovery, where Burnham challenges the Federation's consideration of a genocidal act to destroy the Klingon homeworld.
The Klingons are on the verge of wiping out the Federation.
Yes, but ask yourself, why did you put this mission in the hands of a Terran, and why the secrecy? It's because you know it's not who we are.
It very soon will be. We do not have the luxury of principle.
That is all we have, Admiral. A year ago, I stood alone. I believed that our survival was more important than our principles. I was wrong. Do we need a mutiny today? To prove who we are.
Yes, that scene does come across, in retrospect, a little bit like the "hey, do better, Senator" moment from Falcon and the Winter Soldier, with its belief in our ability to appeal to the better nature of institutions and those in power.
You control the banks. Shit, you can move borders.
You can knock down a forest with the email. You can feed 1 million people with a phone call.
You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up.
But it works somewhat more effectively in Discovery because the Federation is supposed to be an aspirational version and thus theoretically open to being swayed in a way that I don't believe the senators of our real world would be by Captain America in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. But here, in Strange New Worlds, it doesn't want us to sit in a morally complicated gray area like Deep Space Nine, or even point out the problems with the institution like the original series does, or The Next Generation, even if it ultimately does say Starfleet is a good institution, generally speaking. Instead, this episode completely let Starfleet off the hook, despite how it pressured its officers to look away and only stopped doing what it was doing because those officers broke, bent, or questioned what it was trying to do. Instead, the episode just ends on this point of, rah, rah, people make up Starfleet, don't worry about it, and then has the gall to scold those who question Starfleet as biased journalists, at best, unethical at worst. And by the way, this is yet another example of Pike being written as a captain with no moral or authoritative backbone. And it's starting to not only kind of annoy me and make me like Pike less, but it's part of a concerning trend, because we've seen this several times before, like when he had absolutely no reaction to his friend Mbenga unilaterally deciding to murder a war criminal, and then tell him to his face that that's what he did. And I'm not saying that Pike had to take a moral stance I agree with, or even climb up on a high horse, but he had no stance at all. And in episodes like the end of Hegemony Part 1, we see he's literally frozen in dread, unable to make a decision. And honestly, if I didn't know any better, I think the show is intentionally portraying Pike as a weak-willed non-leader just to contrast him with Kirk. Pike's collaborative, even-handed, flat power structure style, the one we clearly saw him have both in Discovery and Season 1 of Strange New Worlds, as well as Captain Burnham portray quite effectively in Season 5 of Discovery, is now being presented as ineffective, while Kirk is being set up to swoop in as the decisive, authoritative, swinging dick cowboy captain who we're seeing he's learning to become from last episode, who is the real type of leader that we need today to save us from true enemies like the Gorn. It's a classic trust the strongman leader just reskinned with Star Trek uniforms. And as a side note, it echoes what we're seeing in politics right now in America. People celebrating Gavin Newsom for his fiery anti-Trump rhetoric while ignoring the way he throws trans people and homeless communities under the bus. That mindset is just dangerous. And I ultimately wonder if the episode was necessarily trying to say any of this outright, but instead reflects a deeper issue with Strange New Worlds this season. This show seems more interested in celebrating Star Trek as a brand than engaging with its potential as political storytelling. It's continually this season treating Star Trek like a sacred text full of action figures to play with, rather than a living narrative that's meant to challenge, question, and evolve based on the current day and age in which it's being made in. It should speak to what's happening now. That's what Star Trek does. So instead, the season leans on the idea that Starfleet is inherently good, that it's on the right side of history, simply because it's Starfleet. And because we know that this is the Utopian Better Future franchise, we're just supposed to trust Starfleet inherently. But that's empty. It flattens Star Trek into just a brand, into a hollow feel-good fantasy that refuses to wrestle with the themes the franchise has always explicitly wrestled with colonialism, military power, institutional power, and instead turning it into props rather than things with meaning. It's just literally going like, hey, Starfleet's cool, I love Starfleet, Starfleet's great, Starfleet's the perfect, institution, I love it so much. Rather than like telling an interesting story with it. It's treating Star Trek like a fun, vapid, empty sci-fi toy. And in other episodes this season, like, that's fine. I don't like it. I find it kind of boring for the most part. But, like, you can make Star Trek into a fun, whatever, vapid sci-fi series if you want to. But when you do that, when explicitly brushing up against real political ideas, real political realities, it stops being harmless, especially if you strip Star Trek of its very real political history while still using its aesthetics and symbols. If you do that, what you're left with is just a weaponized myth, a shiny, simplified version of this franchise that upholds the very power structures the franchise as a whole tries to question. It just becomes jingoistic. This episode clearly wants to emulate episodes like Babylon 5's And Now for a Word, which also used the documentary format gimmick. But in that case, in Babylon 5, it was used to interrogate how mainstream media shapes public perception under rising authoritarianism.
Call the Corps. Call government information for more on a Psi-Corps center near you. This message has been brought to you by the Ministry for Public Information and your local Psi-Corps recruitment office.
It was literally discussing shit like Fox News before those things were conservative propaganda tools for the Trump administration. And ironically is happening to CBS News under Skydance after it acquired Paramount, Star Trek's owners. I mean, quite literally, Skydance is hiring a person to make sure that their news organization doesn't critique the Trump administration. Babylon 5 used that format to critique power.
And we have to make people lift their eyes back to the horizon and see the line of ancestors behind us saying, make my life have meaning. And to our inheritors before us saying, create the world we will live in. I mean, we're not just holding jobs and having dinner. We are in the process of building the future.
But Strange New Worlds here in this episode flips that. It frames leftist critiques of imperialism as biased propaganda, avoids metaphor or allegory entirely, and instead leans on our affection for Star Trek, its legacy as a utopian fun sci-fi franchise that we all like, as the emotional engine of its message. And that just makes the whole thing feel shallow and vapid and empty. I should say, if you really wanted to, you could have a more generous reading of this episode here. You could argue that Starfleet only allowed Umberto's documentary to be released because they knew it would make Starfleet look good. The episode does go out of its way to show that Starfleet refused to declassify certain information, such as who was on the other end of the call to Pike and Una and what that person said. It was most likely April. But in the documentary, it's clearly shown that Starfleet hasn't declassified that information. So it's implied that Starfleet is selectively curating what information it's letting getting out. So if you wanted to read it this way, you could see this episode as about manufactured transparency and institutional spin. And that maybe the real bias in this documentary is Starfleet because it knew it could be used as rah-rah propaganda for itself. But if that is what this episode was intended to be from the writers, it's buried far too deep. Like, I don't think that that's going to be the reading most people are going to walk away with from this episode. If you wanted to do that, you needed to have like a scene at the end of the episode where we cut to Starfleet brass, you know, whatever Badmiral you want to use for the episode, and them being like, yep, that'll look great. We can disseminate that as propaganda for Starfleet. That would make Starfleet look like assholes and terrible, but it would have like read as more intriguing and less jingoistic rah-rah Americana. But they didn't do that. And so if that's their intention, this episode did not get that across. And that's me being very, very charitable to this episode and saying, oh, that maybe that's what they were trying to do. And frankly, I'm not really that charitable to this episode. What the episode ultimately mainly communicates to the audience is American jingoism and utopian Star Trek drag. That's what's mostly going to come out of this. And I think that that is the intended reading because most of this season has been rah, 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 we love Star Trek. Which, in an episode like this, comes across as rah, 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 we love American jingoism. And it's angering to watch Star Trek sidestep real-world issues while simultaneously shaming those who dare to critique colonial power. It's not even like speaking up about these things would be risky right now. Like, I know some people might think it is, but look at something like Superman. That movie literally just said genocide bad, Israel bad, and Russia bad, and it still made Warner Brothers a lot of money. And more importantly, it excited people right now who wanted to hear that message. It shows that something with that actually resonates and gets people pumped, rather than just vapid Star Trek. And I should say, if this episode does play it safe because Paramount was scared of controversy hurting their bottom line or hurting their merger with Skydance, I think that that's cowardice. And if this episode is this way because the writers genuinely believe that people who critique power are the problem, then that's not just disappointing, it's enraging. But if this episode is this way because, and by the way, this is where I would put my money on, the writers were more interested in playing with Star Trek toys than using them to say anything meaningful, then it's lazy and boring. And that's what most of the season, if I'm being quite frank, has felt like. Empty nostalgia, propping up, frankly, rote scripts for the most part that accidentally reinforce modern-day power structures and biases towards heteronormativity and women, and in this episode's case, America. If Star Trek just willingly chooses to be a hollow, meaningless sci-fi toy, then not only does it reflect our ingrained modern biases instead of challenging them, it can quite easily be co-opted for right-wing messaging by those who desire to do so. And believe me, there are those who desire to do so. I mean, look at people like Elon Musk, literally saying, let's make Starfleet Academy real, while literally giving Nazi fucking salutes.
Can you imagine how awesome it will be to have American astronauts plant the flag on another planet for the first time? Bam! Bam! Yeah! How inspiring would that be? You know, there's always problems in life. You know, there's this problem, solve that problem. But you know, there need to be things that inspire you. There need to be things that make you glad to wake up in the morning and say, I'm looking forward to the future.
If you strip Star Trek of its ability to speak against those people, it can be co-opted by them. This is not the time for bland reassurances masquerading as hope. This is the time for Star Trek to make a stand. Because there's a very real possibility that if we don't make clear what Star Trek stands for now, then the billionaire oligarchs will certainly do it for us.